Welcome to a lecture on Dawn of the New Indian Novel in English. My name is Ranjani and I will be running you through the course of this presentation. This presentation seeks to provide an analysis of the novels post Midnight's Children with a focus on the inheritance of loss. The primary objective of this presentation is to assess the role of Indian texts in the canon of world literature. However, this is different from the endeavour undertaken with respect to Silence, the Court is in Session and other works before Midnight's Children, because this work is primarily a work written in English and not a translation from another language. So, the endeavour is also unique for the matter of fact that it is post-colonial in nature and does not have any bearings with the earlier nationalistic endeavour of the previous writings. So, let us get into the objectives of this presentation. The first objective of this presentation is to identify the significance of the inheritance of loss to the canon of world literature. Secondly, to trace the change in the preoccupations of the Indian novel in English since Midnight's Children and to identify the inheritance of loss as part of this changing literary trend. So, in this presentation, I try to provide a non-traditional analysis and I draw largely significantly from the works of Rajeshwari Sundararajan and other post-colonial theorists, from whose works I derive a lot of my main arguments. Also, it will explore a lot of parallel questions regarding other works in literature such as Midnight's Children and The God of Small Things, and it tries to probe why the inheritance of loss may not have established itself as one of the more popular works within this canon. So, let us get into our first objective, which is why is the inheritance of loss important to world literature. So, a basic introduction to the inheritance of loss. The Inheritance of Loss is the second novel by Indian author Kiran Desai. It was first published in 2006. So, this happens to be her second novel. The first novel written by her is Hullabaloo in the Guava Orchard, which was published in 1998 and is a very popular and widely recommended novel in its own right. It is the recipient of a number of awards, including the Man Booker Prize for that year, the National Book Critics Circle Fiction Award in 2007 and the 2006 Vodafone Crossword Book Award. The novel articulates the exile experience and the consequences of globalization from a post-colonial perspective. So, our analysis of this novel will largely concern itself with the last points mentioned in this presentation, which is the novel concerning itself with the exile experience and the consequences of globalization from a post-colonial perspective. And we also try to draw analysis, comparative analysis between the other Booker, which is Midnight's Children, and this Booker itself. More about the novel. The story is set in the village of Kalimpong in the 1980s, and the novel explores the lives of characters who are trapped in India's class system, both the lower class and the upper class. The characters' hopes and dreams are conveyed in the novel, along with the ultimate dream of immigrating to America and finally escaping the rigid caste system of the homeland. So, something that is of significance here is the unusual setting itself in which the novel is located. It happens to be located in the foothills of Darjeeling and explores the unusual theme across different generations. Kalimpong happens to be at the foothills of the Himalaya, and the story itself opens and unfurls in the small village of Cho Oyu in Kalimpong. We will now have a brief overview of the characters involved in this novel. Our primary character is Sai, who is a young girl of 16 years who comes to live with Judge Jemubai Patel when she is orphaned at 9 when her parents died in Moscow in an accident. And she becomes close to Gyan, a Nepali mathematics tutor who is hired to teach her. So, Sai is a character who is located at the conflict of identity, adolescence and personal questions that arise at the intersection of womanhood and teenagehood. So, she becomes a very interesting character and is very central to the plot point of this novel. Our next character is Judge Jemubai Patel, who is an Anglophile and who can be said to have a sort of a colonial hangover from whatever remains of the British past. He is a Cambridge educated judge and is left to care for the child he has never fully known. Has a tortured marriage, is alienated from his world to such an extent that his only close ally is his dog Mutt, whom he treats with affection, and he is never seen to be friendly with the cook. Coming to the cook lives in a hut near the judge's house and is kept on meagre wages and is tremendously proud of his son Biju, whom he imagines to be wildly successful in America. So, this happens to be another very crucial plot point in the novel because it sets the stage for how we the American life is commonly perceived by Indians. As is stated here, he imagines his son to be wildly successful in America. It is in the character of Biju that we see that this very popular myth is disproved. Biju struggles from job to job as an illegal immigrant in New York City and suffers a series of humiliations and trials as he tries to survive in New York, and finally returns to Kalimpong when he hears of the political disturbances in his hometown. Our next two characters, also crucial to the plot, Gyan. Gyan begins the novel as naive as Sai, but eventually he matures due to the GNLF movement that arises in Kalimpong. Gyan is a 20-year-old mathematics tutor who is Nepali in origin. So this is an intersection of different variables in his character that is not commonly seen in a novel. Nepalis are not usually seen to be as well educated or capable of educating others, but Gyan in this novel is a young man of 20 who is not only well educated and well read in mathematics, but is also taking the effort to educate a young girl who is Sai. After the political awakening, Gyan becomes frustrated at Sai's innocence and cultural elitism. It must be mentioned here that Sai and Gyan get romantically involved, but this changes in the later stages of the novel as the story unfolds. Lola and Noni. Lola and Noni are upper class Bengali women who, similar to Judge Jemubai Patel, also suffer from a British hangover, a colonial hangover. They have assimilated many parts of British and Western cultures, such as celebrating Christmas, reading Jane Austen and listening to the BBC. They can also be seen to be extremely proud of their relatives who work in the BBC and are very showing of their contacts within the BBC whom they can connect with when they need any favors. But whether these favors and whether these contacts actually come to their use is a different question altogether. But the mere relationship that they bear with the people in the BBC or with anybody in that part of the world is seen to set them apart from the other people who don't have relationships with people living in the West. Here is an excerpt from a conversation between Lola and Noni. This is particularly significant because it is a cheeky jibe at another popular Indian writer of Trinidad and Tobago origin, who is V.S. Naipaul, and his book is also referenced here, which is A Bend in the Road. So let's go through this excerpt. We had better run to the market, Noni. It will empty out, and our library books, we must change them. I won't last the month, said Lola. Almost through, she tummed A Bend in the River. Uphill task, superb writer, said Noni. First class, one of the best books I've ever read. Oh, I don't know, Lola said. I think he's strange, stuck in the past. He has not progressed. Colonial neurosis. He's never freed himself from it. Quite a different thing now. In fact, she said, chicken tikka masala has replaced fish and chips as the #1 takeout dinner in Britain. It was just reported in the Indian Express. So this conversation is an encapsulation of what this novel attempts to do, which is to replace the colonial neurosis of the past with a new post-colonial analysis. Also signified in the metaphorical statement which she makes, saying chicken tikka masala has replaced fish and chips. So one dominant mode of analysis is now being replaced with another mode of analysis where people of indigenous origins are finally being given an original voice. So this is another excerpt from Homi Bhabha's Freedom's Basis in the Indeterminate, published in 1992, which I believe summarizes all the characteristics that this novel has. So let's go through this. Post-colonial criticism bears witness to the unequal and uneven forces of cultural representation involved in the contest for political and social authority within the modern world order. Post-colonial perspectives emerge from the colonial testimony of third world countries and the discourses of minorities within the geopolitical divisions of East, West, North and South. They intervene in those ideological discourses of modernity that attempt to give a hegemonic normality to the uneven development and the differential, often disadvantaged histories of nations, races, communities, peoples. They formulate their critical revisions around issues of cultural difference, social authority and political discrimination in order to reveal the antagonistic and ambivalent moments within the rationalizations of modernity. So this novel is an undoing of the dominant discourse as mentioned here, and the hegemonic normality is being undone in many ways. So let us have a look at that. Post-colonialism in the inheritance of loss. The best way to approach the inheritance of loss is to consider it under the rubric of post-colonial diasporic fiction. The novel's diasporic location also reveals its cosmopolitan outlook and sensibility. The Inheritance of Loss performs a humanizing function superbly well as regards to many of its Indian and non-Indian characters. So, this tells us that Inheritance of Loss is perfectly conducive to a post-colonial analysis, not just because of its characteristics, but also because of the very themes from which it draws heavily. And as stated previously, the geographical location of this novel is unlike any other, located in the foothills of the Himalaya. How often do we come across a book that is located not just away from the political center, but also the geographic center of the country? Coming to the third point on the slide, the Inheritance of Loss performs a humanizing function. So, what is this humanizing function? Traditionally, Western novel has sought to enlarge the humanistic sensibility of its readers, and many works of canonical English fiction effortlessly engage in what may be termed as a humanizing mission, as they seek to bring members from a formerly overlooked national, gender or social type or niche within the sphere of literary representation. And one could argue that the Inheritance of Loss continues this function extremely well. Not only does it bring marginalized people into the dominant discourse, but also treats them with a unique respect and regard. It helps you connect with people from distant locations and helps you empathize and sympathize with their situations. So, I would like to evoke the opening paragraphs of this novel to state how the geographical location is evoked perfectly in these statements. All day, the colors had been those of dusk, mist moving like a water creature across the great flanks of mountains possessed of ocean shadows and depths. Briefly visible above the vapour, Kanchenjunga was a far peak whittled out of ice, gathering the last of the light, a plume of snow blown high by the storms at its summit. Sai, sitting on the veranda, was reading an article about giant squid in an old National Geographic. Every now and then she looked up at Kanchenjunga, observed its wizard phosphorescence with a shiver. The judge sat at the far corner with his chessboard, playing against himself. Stuffed under his chair, where she felt safe, was Mutt the dog, snoring gently in her sleep. A single bald light bulb dangled on the wire above. It was cold, but inside the house it was still colder. The dark, the freeze, contained by stone walls several feet deep. So, this paragraph perfectly encapsulates the whole essence of this novel by juxtaposing different elements against one another. For instance, here in the first paragraph is a very elegant description of the mountains as whittled out of ice and gathering the last of light, and right in the next paragraph is an article about the giant squid in an old National Geographic magazine. So, there is an instance of how the virtual geography presented in National Geographic is just juxtaposed against the actual geography that is right in front of their eyes in the foothills of the Kanchenjunga. Also present is the judge himself, who is engaged in a game of chess with the dog tucked under the chair below his feet. So, this provides a very good entry point into understanding how the novel takes place and how the story unfolds and what to expect itself. So, the next theme of significance in this novel is globalization in The Inheritance of Loss. So, the novel critiques globalization by articulating a less explored theme of the exile experience in the West and provides a commentary on cross-cultural hegemony. So, as I stated previously, a large portion of our understanding of the American dream is occupied by notions of success and splendor and a good capitalist comfortable life in the States. But this novel disproves that myth and actually explains the transition of the American dream into the American nightmare. And this is evoked through the character of Biju, who goes to America as an illegal immigrant and is made to face the worst situations of his life there. Not only does he hop from job to job, but is also subject to the worst possible conditions that a human can be subjected to. He lives with rats in the basement of somebody's house, and he is treated very poorly by his own employers themselves. So, through the character of Biju, Kiran Desai provides a very sharp and incisive critique to globalization. Coming to the commentary on cross-cultural harmony, she provides a rendition of the Gorkha land insurgency and brings to fore questions of identity, loyalty, history that are entangled within this question. So, the character of Gyan becomes very significant to this objective of Kiran Desai's. Finally, it argues that multiculturalism confined to the Western world does not begin to address the causes of extremism and violence in the modern world. So, these are some drawbacks of globalization that the author highlights in the novel. We will now have a look at a quote that symbolizes the kind of suffering that Biju underwent in the United States. You lived intensely with others only to have them disappear overnight, since the shadow class was condemned to movement. The men left for other jobs, towns, got deported, returned home, changed names. Sometimes someone came popping around a corner again or on the subway and then they vanished again. Addresses, phone numbers did not hold. The emptiness Biju felt returned to him over and over until eventually he made sure not to let friendships sink deep anymore. So, an important term that is been mentioned in this paragraph is shadow class. So, not only does she evoke the immigrant experience abroad, but also brings to light the intersection of different classes and the dominance of one class over the other and the suppression of the shadow class. So, now we move on to our next slide. So, could fulfillment ever be felt as deeply as loss? So, in this one statement, Kiran Desai encapsulates the whole purpose of this novel, which is to say that a lot of benefits and a lot of prosperity derived from one generation by the next can never be satisfied or can never be compensated, because the extent of the loss that is felt as a consequence of this is so deep, as deeply as loss. While one generation inherits characteristics, property and traits from another generation, the biggest thing that they inherit happens to be loss, and thus the title of this novel is justified, the inheritance of loss, the one thing that they inherit that they cannot escape. All the characters are caught in a situation of their own making, but also of something that they have inherited that is of no escape to them. So, coming to the next objective of this presentation, what are the preoccupations of the Indian novel in English since Midnight's Children? This becomes particularly important for us to address because before Midnight's Children, a lot of Indian writing in English did not receive much widespread attention from the West, but since Midnight's Children became a popular work and after it won the Booker, a lot of Indian writing began to receive global attention in Anglophone circuits. So, let us get into this. So, the burden of the nation. At this stage, I would like to set the context for pre-Booker writing in India and how the transition occurred between pre-Booker writing and post-Booker writing. Burden of the nation. Writers are burdened with a higher degree of self-awareness, and the guardianship of tradition that seems to have suddenly befallen the Indian writer was becoming evident to them. And the realignment of power in the Indian polity and the subsequent weakening of the centre accompanied this. So, burden here refers to the content that these authors engage with in their novels, and these questions constantly bring to fore the relationship between the writer and their subjects. Who can speak about what? How does the author feel about the subject that they are writing about? So, this also brings to the author an awareness of the responsibility that they have towards the subjects and opens up a range of attitudes and ideologies with which they have to engage and which they have to address. Burden of the nation, some examples. The Stoic diagnosis of history is against our class and Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy. So, this is particularly significant after the passing of the Zamindar Abolition Act and the character called Nawab Sahib in this novel talks about how the history is suddenly against our class in that particular novel. And the mocking of Oxford educated Indians, including herself, as irrelevant Indians in Sagarika Ghose's Gin Drinkers, published in 2000. The writers must yield to the new and newly relevant Indians who are also now the upwardly mobile Dalit intellectuals and the vulgar entrepreneurs. So, there is an evident shift from one class to another, and writers are now beginning to acknowledge that there is a disparity in class that has to be acknowledged through their characters in these novels, and also brings to fore questions of one's own relevance to the nation and whether these questions need to be laid open in a more inclusive manner. And some generational change is also conveyed in these novels, and this is also something that Kiran Desai conveys in her title, which is The Inheritance of Loss. The change conveyed by her with regard to the generation is fleshed out very well in this novel. And the writers also internalize a sense of entitlement compounded by a previously mentioned burden and awareness of their centrality to the nation. The writers therefore begin seeing themselves as intellectual leaders and prophets of modernity. So, how does one write a nation level novel? Should this naturally possess a dominant perspective or adhere to things that are commonly accepted to the dominant class? These are some questions to consider. Loss of power of the ruling class. As I stated previously, there is an awareness of the change in the status that does not necessarily imply a complete loss of power. Can a redundancy in the task of nation building be observed? How does this affect the ruling class? From its position as a proxy for the nation, this class has now graduated to thinking of itself as a portrait of the nation. So, the arrival of the new Indian novel in English did not just signify a huge change for the literary trends in India, but also for class in India, because there is a replacement or a proxy for one class by another, and there are questions coming to the fore about whom the task of nation building must fall on and whether there is a complete loss of power or not. A new patriotism, an exhaustion with nationalist sentiments and settling into the bad habits of nationhood. This is something that is stated by Rajeshwari Sundararajan in her analysis. Consequently, questions of opposing the nation or opposing this nation as forms of patriotism are brought to the fore. As said by Arundhati Roy, I secede, I hereby declare myself an independent mobile republic. And this expression of secession, as seen by one other critic called Amitava Kumar, is an instance of the narrowly individualistic, even selfish attitude that leaves a lot of people behind. However, Rajeshwari Sundararajan points out that this is not a lack of identification with the nation or disidentification. The term secession might throw you off, but this is in fact a hyper identification with the nation. And let us also look at how a critique of nationalism is always expressed in the voice of an individual, but a voice of nationalism that is expressed in favor of the nation is always seen as a collective voice. So, the language of individualism is always seen to play a role in the expression of dissent within the novel. So, this is probably one of the reasons that God of Small Things also received a large amount of attention, because it brought to fore the fact that voices of dissent and disapproval can be expressed, and it articulated the different ways in which dissent and disapproval can be expressed, and how these voices are typically framed through a rejection of compulsory nationalism. So, coming back to that one question about what makes one an Indian or what attributes nationality to one. In the age that we live, passports are what define nationality. At this stage, we should address the question of how we define nationality. We must acknowledge that we live in an age where nationality is acknowledged based on our passports. But Shyama Futeli, in her idea of India, talks of all we ever thought about India is that we have to live in it. So, how do we define what it means to be an Indian? In a slightly controversial but interesting definition, Suddhabrata Sengupta's piece titled Confessions of an Anti-National defines nationality as a limited choice, a great deal of coercion and considerable indifference and some convenience. This is how national identity is articulated in different works. Finally, let us come to our understanding of a workman-like novel. One critic says that it is the trial of exile, while another adds, the world is viewed through the eyes of children and anti-Americanism. So, these are also themes that we probed when we discussed globalization and the critiques of globalization in this novel. Eileen Battersby, commentator at the Irish Times, characterizes Desai's work as solid, workman-like, earnest, traditional, and she judged that this year's Booker is one of the more low-key ones. Another review of the novel, an exactitude of freshness that resists melodrama. So, what exactly do we understand from the term workman-like? Workman-like perhaps refers to a term that signifies that something is competent and very efficient, but perhaps not inspiring. But why is that the case? What makes The Inheritance of Laws a workman-like novel? So, for one, it is removed from the political center of Indian writing. It finally shifts the focus from popular cities like Delhi, Bombay and the metros to a hill station and draws parallels with the life of an individual living as an illegal immigrant in one of the more popular cities in the country, in the world, which is New York. So, the juxtaposition of these two lives lends itself very well to the decentering and the destabilizing of the hegemonic discourse that has come to dominate literary writing in India. Finally, it elicited more response from Nepali readers. At this point, we must acknowledge that the Indian writer does hold some amount of power within the canon. It had been stated previously that if a Nepali reader were to read the novel, they would have problems and issues with the novel that they would not be able to convey very significantly. If it were an Indian reader reading the same, they would not feel so strongly about the misrepresentation of Nepalis. But because the Indian reader has that kind of power within the South Asian literary scene, the Indian reader is able to take the liberty of talking about Nepalis within a novel about Indians. But this is not the same kind of power that Nepali readers and writers have within their literary circles. So, we must acknowledge that Indian readers and writers have their own power. Finally, the novel's criticism of the Gokaland insurgency is fraught with difficulties. At this point, I would like to evoke the critique by B.P. Giri, who has written in 2007 about the drawback of the Gorkhaland insurgency as portrayed in this novel. The novel's criticism of the Gorkhaland insurgency is fraught with difficulties. Historically, the Subhas Ghising led insurgency was not really about throwing out non-Nepali residents of the hills. In spite of its adoption of violent tactics, the novel justly criticizes. Instead, its agenda included self-empowerment of a marginalized community by demanding access to state institutions and resources. In addition, the insurgency is broadly understood to have challenged not so much the legitimacy of Indian nation per se, but the long-time hold of the ethnic Bengali elite in the politics, industry and bureaucracy of the state of West Bengal in general and in Darjeeling and Kalimpong hills in particular. So, what B.P. Giri here is trying to say is that the author should have recognized her own identity before embarking on this endeavour, because it might have lent a partisan view of the events unfolding in the novel itself. As a Bengali herself, Kiran Desai could have perhaps provided a more introspective analysis of what it means to be Indian and rather not what it means to be an ethnic Bengali elite in this framework. So, these are some critiques of the novel. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation. These are my references. Thank you.